The Nile River flows in Africa, one of the longest river systems in the world. The river originates on the East African Plateau and flows into the Mediterranean Sea, forming a delta with an area of 24,000 square kilometers. The Nile water system is considered the longest on Earth. However, according to Brazilian researchers, the longest river system is in the Amazon. According to these data, its length is 6,992 kilometers, while the length of the Nile system is 6,852 kilometers. The source is in Rwanda. This is the Rukarara River, which flows into the Kagera River. The water flow changes strongly and sharply throughout the year. The river waters are used for irrigation and electricity generation. Almost the entire population lives in the delta and valley of the Nile, and almost the entire economy of Egypt is based. The largest cities are Cairo, Khartoum, Aswan, Alexandria. The Nile is tens of millions of years old. It is strictly forbidden to swim in it, and it does not dry up even in the driest area, in the Sahara. The Egyptians called the Nile Itera, which means big river. This is one of the most remarkable rivers in the world. The natural conditions of the valley surrounding it have been of great importance to residents since ancient times. The Nile is one of the most famous waterways of the planet, is shrouded in controversy and unresolved issues. Why does no one know the exact length of the Nile, nor the reliable number of its tributaries? The Nile River Basin covers 11 states of the African continent at once, and the total length of this river system is about 7,000 kilometers. By the way, the Amazon is almost the same length. It is impossible to determine exactly which of these two reservoirs is longer. Over the years, the indicators change. Therefore, the two rivers are constantly competing for the title of the longest. But in terms of its full flow, the Nile, fed by rain and underground springs, is inferior to its South American sister, and seriously, almost twice as much. Not only the Egyptians, but even the Greeks and Romans worshipped the Nile as a deity. In the Vatican, there is a statue of the river god playing with 16 suns, who symbolize 16 of its tributaries. This is a copy of a colossal sculpture by an unknown Greek master of the 2nd century AD. But the ancient Egyptians, as if hinting that the sources of the river are unknown, depicted the Nile as a humanoid creature, with a head covered with cloth. Even the ancient Greek historian Herodotus tried to find the place where the great river originates. However, traveling through Egypt and receiving a lot of information on the natural conditions of the Nile, he could not get to its sources. 5 later, the Roman philosopher and statesman Seneca wrote about the upper reaches of the Nile from the words of the participants of the exploratory expedition organized by the Emperor Nero. They said that upstream the river becomes a swamp full of algae, through the waters of which it is impossible to pass by boat. In these places live black people who trade in bone and exotic furs. On a 12th century map made by the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi, the Nile is depicted flowing out of a large lake in East Africa. In 1613, the Portuguese missionary priest Pedro Pius proved that this was indeed the case. Exploring Lake Tana, he followed the Abay River flowing out of it, and correctly concluded that it was the source of the Blue Nile. However, this is only a right tributary of the Great River. The search for the sources of the White Nile, a larger left tributary, dragged on for several more centuries. 7. But it was only in 1863 that the deputy head of the London Geographical Society expedition, John Speke, surveyed Lake Victoria Nyanza and discovered a large river flowing north. This was the White Nile. The legendary river flows from south to north and connects the East African plateau with the Mediterranean Sea. But scientists do not have a clear answer to the question of where the source of the Nile is. According to the most common point of view, the river flows out of the largest body of water in Africa, Lake Victoria. And yet, we can confidently name 2 of the most famous tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The first is a section of the river that stretches through the territory of Sudan. This name is associated with the large amount of white clay that its own tributary Sobat brings. The second tributary is the Blue Nile, which flows out of Lake Tana on the Abyssinian highlands. It is interesting that for the inhabitants of Ethiopia, this river is sacred. They believe that it is necessary to present gifts to it, usually food. In the rainy season, the waters of the tributary make up 60% of the total flow of the Nile, but in the dry season, the river becomes shallow. Off the coast of Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, the White and Blue Niles merge, and from here they rush in a single stream to the very north of Africa, to the endless Mediterranean Sea. Nile Delta, one of the most ancient granaries of the world, stretches along the Mediterranean coast for 260 kilometers, from Alexandria to Port Said. It is in the Nile Delta that most of Egypt's agricultural products are produced, and it is near it that almost half of the country's 100 million population lives. It is interesting that from space, the mouth of the Nile River resembles a lotus flower on a long stem, which, by the way, once adorned the coat of arms of Egypt. In the vicinity of Cairo, the Nile branches into several branches, hence such picturesque outlines. Egyptian civilization arose approximately 5,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile. The great river nourished the soil, creating favorable conditions for agriculture and, as a consequence, for the development of the economy and culture. According to the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was ruled by the god Hapi. He was depicted as an elderly, well-fed man, dressed in a fisherman's loincloth. On his head was a nemes, a scarf symbolizing the power of the pharaohs and decorated with papyrus stems. The ancient Egyptians believed that Hapi lived in a huge cave, which was located somewhere near the source of the river, and the reservoir itself flowed from a magic jug. According to myths, sometimes the god of the Nile began to pour water from a second jug. At this time, the river overflowed and watered the parched land with healing moisture. That is why Hapi also symbolized fertility. Thanks to him, agricultural crops and grass for cattle grew on the banks of the river. In other words, the river patron was a kind and caring god. 13. In the myths of the ancient Greeks, the patron of the great river was also described. A god named Nile was considered one of the first kings of Egypt. Although his father, Oceanus, had thousands of sons and daughters, Nile was among the most significant. He was responsible for the well-being of the Egyptians and was usually depicted with a cornucopia and near the Sphinx. One of the ancient Greek myths tells of how the river dried up. When the demigod Phaethon could not cope with the solar chariot and fell to the ground, the Nile decided that the end of the world had come. He hid so reliably that the river disappeared for a while. Famous cities on the banks of the Nile. They are located in the valley and in the delta of the river. Cairo, the capital of Egypt, is one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, with 25 million people living here. Travelers come here primarily for Giza, a southwestern suburb of Cairo. It is here that you can see the only one of the 7 wonders of the world that has survived to this day, the Pyramid of Cheops. Luxor, an open-air museum, almost in the center of the country. Among the main attractions of this treasury of ancient civilization is the Karnak Temple, a huge architectural complex, the construction of which took a total of about 1,300 years, is dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, his wife, Queen Mut, and their son Khonsu. Avenue of sphinxes with ram heads, multi-column halls, obelisks, the sacred Lake Aswan. In ancient times, this border town in the south of the country was called the Egyptian Gateway to Africa. Among the main attractions of Aswan is the Botanical Garden, considered one of the most beautiful in Egypt. It appeared not so long ago, at the end of the 20th century, and its pride is a collection of palm trees, a whole 100 species. 18 Edfu, another city in the Nile Valley, attracting lovers of ancient architecture from all over the world. The main attraction of Edfu is the temple erected in honor of Horus, the god of the sky and the sun. He was usually depicted in the form of a falcon, or a man with the head of a feathered predator. This monumental building, the construction of which lasted 180 years, is well preserved. The thing is that for centuries it was under a thick layer of sand and was only discovered by the French at the beginning of the 19th century. Alexandria. Founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great, the city in the Nile Delta is one of the main centers of the Hellenistic era. Among the many attractions of Alexandria is the Kate Fort, built in the 15th century on the ruins of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the world, destroyed by earthquakes. The impregnable citadel, founded by the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay, belonged to the Ottoman Empire for centuries, but was taken by Napoleon at the end of the 18th century. The flora and fauna of one of the largest rivers in the world amazes with its diversity. Let's start with fish. There are dozens of species in the Nile. Among them is the Nile perch, which can reach 2 meters in length and weigh up to 200 kilograms. Although this silvery fish is not only beautiful but also very aggressive, for many travelers who enjoy fishing, catching it is a cherished dream. One of the most famous inhabitants of the river is the Nile crocodile. This is the largest of the amphibian subspecies living in Africa. It reaches 5 meters in length and weighs up to 500 kilograms. It is curious that the ancient Egyptians not only feared this predator, but also treated it with great respect. The god of water Sobek, for example, was depicted with a human body and a crocodile head. No less dangerous hippos are found in the southern part of the Nile River. A furious animal is capable of biting off the terror of the reservoir, a crocodile. However, for the ancient Egyptians, surprisingly, the hippopotamus was also a sacred animal. The goddess Tort, the patroness of children and women, was depicted in the guise of this animal. Until recently, it was believed that the river was approximately 5 million years old. However, in the late 2010s, after a comprehensive study conducted by an international group of scientists, it turned out that the Nile is much older. It is about 30 million years old. The Egyptians were also famous for their navy. They were very successful in shipbuilding. They built rowboats over 23 meters long. The planks knocked together to form the hull were secured with fabric straps, and the seams were rubbed with wood resin. The most ancient ships were discovered by archaeologists in Egypt. These are 14 boats found near the burial site of Pharaoh Khafre, and known as the boats from Abydos. The oldest of them, according to experts, is about 5,000 years old and may have belonged to Pharaoh Hora, the founder of the city of Memphis. It was the Egyptians who made the first round-the-world trip, only they did it around the part of the world known to them, the African continent. But at that time, the Egyptians did not at all strive to go around Africa. Moreover, they most likely did not even suspect that this was possible. The goal of the expedition organized by Pharaoh Necho II was the mysterious country of Ophir, from which gold was transported in the old days. The journey lasted 3 years. The sailors made long stops in places where, according to the pharaoh's assumption, the mysterious country could be located, but it was never found. Then the travelers stocked up on provisions and set off again. The expedition of Pharaoh Necho continued until, unexpectedly for themselves and their relatives, the travelers passed the Pillars of Hercules. They returned to Egypt from the other side, having completely circled Africa. This sea voyage is famous not only because the Egyptians were the first to circle the vast continent. It was the first official expedition confirmed by documents.